Hello, everyone, and welcome to RBCM at Home. My name is Kim Goff, and I'm a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum. I'm coming to you today from my office, which is located on the territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, the Lekwungen-speaking people in Victoria, British Columbia. RBCM at Home started in March when our museum and archive closed due to the pandemic. It was an opportunity to talk to staff about what they were working on from home. And now that some of us are back at the museum, this continues to be an opportunity to reach out to folks around BC and continue to engage with us. And so we can continue to engage with you while you may be at home. Today, we are speaking with Jana Stefan, who is the production team lead for exhibitions. In her day job, Jana manages the exhibits art staff who build and maintain our exhibits and interactives. But before that, she worked for 2 seasons in Antarctica as a conservator at the world's most remote historic site, Scott's Hut. The Men of Scott's Hut Antarctic exhibition used the hut for a variety of purposes, including scientific experiments. The hut is now protected under the Antarctic Treaty and cared for by the Antarctic Heritage Trust. Jana, thank you so much for stepping in today to help us out. Can you tell us, how did you first find out about this opportunity in Antarctica?
It was actually another staff member at the museum who told me about it and said, I heard about this really cool opportunity and I think it's something that you would really enjoy, because I've done a lot of remote outdoor work in the past. And it's sort of a well-known project in the conservation community because it's so epic in scale and also because of where it is. So she put me on the lead and I took it from there. So.
Excellent. And what year was this? When did you go down?
The first year I went down was 2008 and the second year was 2012.
Oh, excellent. And so this project started not much longer before 2008, did it? Or how long has Antarctica Heritage Trust been working on the hut?
The trust has actually been around since 1987, but for the first sort of 15 years, they were just doing bare bones maintenance. And then when it became clear that deterioration was accelerating, they launched this big, more interventive project. And I think they started in earnest probably 2006-07 season, I want to say. Yeah, so I was there pretty early in the run. And then since I've been back, they've gone on to complete work at all 5 of the huts that you mentioned earlier. So
amazing. Great. Well, I know you have some photographs to share with us. So we'll get you to share your screen so we can see, so we can take our virtual trip to Antarctica.
That's right. Screen 1, share. Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
We do see that. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So today, like Kim mentioned, I'm going to take you to Antarctica and speak a little bit about the preservation project that I worked on at Scott's Terra Nova hut. I was lucky enough to work at his Discovery hut and Shackleton's hut as well, but today we're just going to focus on this one to keep it simple. So I've got a bunch of images and I'll just walk you through it. And like Kim mentioned, if you have questions, type them in and she'll get them to me. So at the turn of the sort of 19th to 20th century was when sort of any first significant landfall was made on Antarctica. And at the time, a few different expeditions went down and they were largely living in their ships and making short forays into land. And that's what Scott did on his first trip. But on his second trip, again, as Kim mentioned, 1910 to 1913, they really hoped to establish a bigger base camp and to carry out a lot more science in addition to just their geographic discoveries. So they made landfall here on Ross Island, which is a small little volcanic island. That's Mount Erebus, an active volcano named for an earlier explorer ship. And they landed 27 men and all the supplies they would need for a few years and started to set up camp. So Their main goal, as we mentioned, was sort of discovery, and they hoped to take a stab at reaching the South Pole. But they were also there to carry out a lot of science. So they were doing biology, marine biology, climatology. They were studying the volcano. They were studying ice. They sort of really birthed the discipline of glaciology in the Southern Hemisphere, and parasitology. They had a huge scientific crew they were supporting. And so all of this needed a space. And so they brought with them a prefabricated hut, which was all sort of just shipped down on the ship in different pieces. Back along the wall there, you see a whole bunch of, these are fodder bales, so straw for the ponies. They had a whole complement of ponies that they hoped were going to be helpful in getting them to the pole. So when they first got there, they set up this building and slowly worked at making it their own. It didn't take long for it to sort of look very well lived in. And of course, the snow encroaches on everything pretty quickly down there. And so this was their base camp for the next couple years. And it was a tight space for 24 men overwintered that first year. So they each sort of had their own bunk space and all their own personal gear. Which, as you can imagine, was fairly bulky, just with the cold. And they had to have enough food to last them not only the 3 years, but, you know, potentially a couple extra years in case the ship wasn't able to make it back down there again, because they never really knew with the pack ice surrounding the continent if they would be able to be picked up as planned. So there was a huge amount of food supplies. They also had all of their scientific equipment and had various little science stations set up inside the hut. This is the surgeon and parasitologist, Atkinson. And of course, a stable is attached on the back for the ponies and for the dogs. And so they sort of spent their winter there, getting all of their stuff ready, taking a lot of weather readings, and just sort of working to become a team. And the following year, they set out to reach the pole, which, like we said in the poll at the beginning, they did reach. Unfortunately, they found a tent with a Norwegian flag when they got there. And if you're familiar with the story at all, you know that the Polar Party unfortunately perished on the way home. They ran into some really bad weather. They had some bad injuries, and they did not make it back. So once the rest of the team realized that they weren't coming back, as soon as the ship came back to retrieve them, they sort of jumped on board and all took off and left the site looking like this. So this image is from 1911, because Ponting would have left the first year, but when they left, it would have looked very much like that. And then this shows how the hut looks today. So remarkably, very little has changed in the last 100 years. The Antarctic climate is wonderful because it's nice and cold and dry. It's kind of like a freezer. It keeps a lot of things in stasis. And so the site has just survived in really quite good condition. And also because there's very, very little human intervention. Any historic sites in the rest of the world obviously have sort of higher traffic all the time, and that can cause a lot of issues. So the interior of the huts also still look very similar to how they did in the heroic era. You know, again, lots of supplies left there. It would have been a lot of work to pack up and haul everything back, and they were just sort of dejected from the loss of their leader in the party, so they really did sort of cut and run. So a lot of the science corners look really remarkably similar to how they did in the heroic era. And there's just this amazing array of scientific glassware and chemicals and all kinds of really interesting things still down there. There are still also a huge amount of food supplies down there, which various parties since then were able to use to their advantage. There was another expedition that ended up staying in this hut a few years later, and so they were very grateful for the extra food that was there. So all these beautiful sort of Edwardian packages and labels, containers are just really cool to see in that environment. One of my favorites, the lunch tongue. There's all kinds of strange things. Also lots of personal equipment, so their bunks are still just, pillows and sleeping bags and clothes, hats and boots, and this lovely pair of improvised crampons. So somebody has sort of sewn these out of canvas and hammered nails through and made lashing. Here's the photographic journal that Kim mentioned in the preview. This worked its way out of a little stream. And it's really special when you can find things down there that have, people's handwriting, or you can sort of tie it to a specific explorer, because it just helps sort of round out the context for the items. But of course, even though the Antarctic environment has done a good job of preserving things largely, it still is a very harsh place. Windy, snowy, cold, all of the above. And that has taken a toll on the site, and that is why the Antarctic Heritage Trust did shift at one point from sort of maintaining the sites as is to having to really sort of roll up their sleeves and do a little bit more. Every year, they would send a team out to check on the huts, and every year when they show up, the snow is just to the roof or covering parts of the roof. And there's this, it's sort of nestled into this hillside, and on the uphill backside, the ice was literally just forcing its way through the boards into the hut. And then in the summer, the temperature does actually get above zero. It hovers between 0 and 5 degrees Celsius. So some of that ice melts and drips a bunch of water into the hut, and then the humidity inside spikes. And you get wonderful things like all your metals will corrode. So there's a ton of rust, and you get there's a few native Antarctic fungal species and also some imported ones that came down. So you get lots of messy mold starting to damage things as well. So when they started the project, a lot of that looked like this, just sort of rusty tins of food, spilling 100-year-old roasted veal all over the shelf, or you would pick up a jam jar and it would just explode and jam would go everywhere. So it was really at risk to, forgive the cold term, but snowballing. Once things get to a certain point, there's not really, you can't go back. So they had to get in there quick and take some decisive action.
Jana.
And it wasn't all straightforward. There's certain things, this shelf shows a bunch more food supplies, but you can see a lot of it here covered with like a black greasy soot. And what that is actually the remnants of the later party that I mentioned that stayed in this hut. They had no fuel supply, so they were burning frozen planks of seal blubber, which is probably as terrible as it sounds. And that deposited this greasy black soot all over everything, which
Jana,
initially you would think that we would try to clean off, but because it is one of the only surviving historical layers of that expedition, the trust actually decided to keep that layer. So now you have to try to conserve an object without disturbing this kind of fine greasy layer on top. So a really interesting conservation project, just because there's a lot of judgment calls that need to be made, as with all conservation work, but just it was a really exciting project to be involved with, because it's just so human in its scope, because everything, or at least I did, because we were sort of versed in the history when we were down there, but the stories are so primal, and it just manifests itself in the objects that are still there. So they're very special places, especially this hut. It's a very special place. So
Jana,
other damage that was starting to happen was anything, organic materials like wood, the wind and ice just sort of wear it away. And because it is a volcanic island, as I mentioned, the ground, when the snow melts, is actually like a fine volcanic gravel, like pumice. And that is just, it abrades everything. Another concern is that there's all sorts of these food caches around the hut, so that if something happened and the hut burned down, or if they couldn't get to a place, they knew they would have another supply cache. These are now starting to deteriorate everywhere and not only spill into the environment, but Ross Island is home to a really large population of skua, which are a sort of especially aggressive gull, and they love to get into all of those, the previous slide showed tins of oatmeal and grain spilling everywhere. So it was sort of imperative to clean that stuff up just to minimize environmental impact. of the sites. So just a quick synopsis of the work that the Trust does. And as I mentioned, they have finished the bulk of the conservation work there now and are sort of in a maintenance stage. But they have worked on all 5 of the huts. And it's this really great program that has involved conservators from all over the world doing sort of, there's a winter program and a summer program, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. So one of the first things that teams do when they get out to the huts every year is there's a certain amount of manual snow removal that has to happen. So usually a team of 6 or 7 people, it takes them a good 2 or 3 days to dig the hut out, depending on what the winter was like. Sometimes it's a solid block of ice that you have to chip out, but generally you sort of make enough space to navigate around. And by the end of the summer, all of that snow usually has melted. Like you can see here, this is just the view looking the opposite direction. So some of the original work that they did at Cape Evans, this site, was they put, you know, they made the tough decision to introduce modern materials. So they lifted the original siding and then put weatherproof membrane underneath so that that ice couldn't push through the building anymore. And they dug this barrier a couple feet into the ground so that the water wouldn't run underneath the hut anymore. They did a bunch of sealing work around the windows and doors to stop the snow ingress, because again, sort of every winter you'd come into the hut and the winds are so strong it just blows the snow through every tiny little crevice, and you get sort of these giant snow drifts inside the hut, which cause all sorts of problems again with when they melt and they get things wet and you get the mold and the humidity. So one of the bigger projects they did at this hut was they actually removed all of the floorboards to dry them out. And also because we suspected, and then when we removed them, we confirmed that the entirety of the hut, there was just solid ice underneath. So by hand, a team chipped this all out and carried it all outside. And then we had like a big hot air melter system that we then blew under the floorboards where we couldn't remove them, and managed to melt all the hut out and really dried the space out. And that made a huge difference in the overall sort of state of the hut. And it feels very different inside now. It doesn't feel like this sort of dank, damp kind of cave-like space. It feels more like a cabin, which is how it would have felt when it was occupied. Another big piece of work is collecting objects from the environment around the hut. Just the wind tends to scatter things everywhere, and so there's all little bits and pieces that you find outside. And during the summer season, when there's a small team working on site, some conservation does take place. There's a couple shipping containers that have been dragged on site, and so we have little labs that we can work in there. Usually it's just easiest to work outside if the weather is cooperating. Of course, the weather doesn't always cooperate, and working outside often looks like this. And that's another thing, that working on this project really brings you closer to the site that you're working on, because we did have to endure the same conditions as them. Obviously not the sledging to the pole, sort of carrying everything you need, consuming 8,000 calories a day, but you know, working in Antarctica is definitely its own challenges even today. So every summer they would have packed up a couple hundred artifacts to transport back to a nearby research station. And then over the winter, a team of conservators lives at that station. So everything gets packed into boxes, which gets packed into bigger boxes, and then they get put on skis and hauled over the sea ice back to Scott Base, which is the main New Zealand Antarctic research station. And the Trust had a little mobile lab set up there. So in this clearly not staged image, nice pristine lab coats, I love it. A team spends the winter there conserving, you know, up to, I don't know, I think probably 5,000 artifacts was the biggest winter they got through, to prepare them to get brought back to the hut the next season. So just a little synopsis of some of the objects that got treated. Here's a pony snowshoe made of bamboo. by all accounts, not successful at all. I don't even know how they got them on the ponies, let alone thought they would work, but pretty cool object. Here's a Primus stove that was so integral to their survival when they were on the march to the pole. And again, lots of everyday items like soap and tinned food that sort of separated from their environment aren't remarkable, but because they still are where they are and because they're in so many of those historic photos of the expeditions, they just are imbued with a greater meaning. This was one of my favorite objects. It's a finnesko, which is a reindeer skin bootie, and this was one of the few instances where they actually took the advice of some of the Laplanders and other Arctic peoples that they talked to and sort of embraced that centuries-old technology. And you can see the inside is stuffed with straw for insulation. This is a walking stick with Cherry Guard's initials carved into it. Again, it was always just really special to find something that you knew belonged to a certain person. And I loved this one. You can see the sooty fingerprints of whoever was reading this book, clearly under great duress with the little blubber lamps and everything. So this is a good example of you can see the volcanic rock there, the scoria that just abrades everything. And it's also, it's kind of like reverse quicksand. You could have walked in a space for like a couple days, and then the next time you walk there, just stepping on these rocks churns artifacts up out of the ground. And so you'll walk by and something like a perfectly preserved 100-year-old onion will come up out of the ground, or this beautiful little glass bottle with contents still intact. So even though the project is largely considered finished, they still are recovering more and more artifacts every time they go back to do maintenance at the huts, just because they're literally working their way up out of the ground. Well, the project was at sort of the height of its at full swing. I think there was a team of 7 or 8 people living on site. So they dragged a couple sea cans out there. So there was a little living station. This was the conservation lab. This was a big carpentry shop. And the conservators all live in tents. And so we're living out here in a tent with no showers, no internet, no phone. We each got sort of 7 minutes of satellite call a week, I think, was the deal. So working with a really tight-knit team in this space was a really cool experience. Everything had to be dragged out there over the ice. So the beginning of every season was sort of this like push to set up the infrastructure that hopefully you would be able to leave out there for a couple years, because in the second half of the season, when the sea ice all broke out, the only option was to helicopter things in and out. This is moving a big fuel cache. And so obviously more challenging in terms of the amount of stuff that you can transport back and forth, and also just more complicated. And I mean, even the helicopter has to get to Antarctica somehow. So this is a great shot of the C-17. So everybody that works down in Antarctica gets carried down by US military transport, although there are a few domestic carriers now from New Zealand, I think. But everything that runs these programs has to get, brought down there somehow. It's a great shot of a couple of the tents, and the tents we would sleep in were basically identical in design to the ones that Scott had used. So again, just another cool layer of getting to experience a piece of what the explorers would have. This is inside one of our sea cans on Christmas, obviously. So we sort of did our best to make it as home-like as possible. We did get mail every now and then. But yeah, it was a nice space. The first season I worked down there, we did not have a container. And so I think we had a tiny little it was like an ice fishing hut that we could cook in, but we were more outside. Whereas by the later stages of the project, there was sort of more infrastructure, and it was nice to have this space covered in solar panels. So we had power in here, which was a huge, huge benefit. but it was just outside of the work, it was just a beautiful space. The environment just absolutely stunning. And so with 24-hour daylight, you know, we would work like dogs all day and then just really try to take advantage of the time at night to go for long walks and just sort of sit and enjoy the space that we were in, because not very many people get down there. And so it was a great privilege, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to work on objects like this memorial cross that was raised by Scotsmen for the men that perished in the Polar Party, which is just set up on this spectacular hill overlooking the edge of Ross Island. So yeah, that is basically, in a nutshell, my experience down there and sort of the project that happened. On the front end, there was a whole bunch of philosophical stuff that had to be worked out about the conservation, which again just sort of made it just really interesting in all regards. But I will stop sharing my screen.
And we'll get your camera back on, I hope.
So let me see if I can do that. There.
You're almost there. Well, your camera is still black, but I think hopefully we'll see you in just a second. I've seen the president years ago. We had an exhibition on race to the South Pole, and you spoke then. It was, I think, about 7 years ago, and I'm still fascinated now hearing about your work and the experiences that you had there. A couple things. There you are. A couple of things that came to mind. All the equipment you'd have to be sleeping in a tent and to be working down there. Is that something you had to provide yourself, or was there guidance or supplies given to you?
There was a sort of a full set of gear that you got from Antarctica, New Zealand. So Antarctica, New Zealand supported the trust. They worked in partnership very closely. And so the gear that was available to, say, all the scientists that were working down there, we had that same gear. So the tents and the sleeping bags and all of that stuff was provided, as well as sort of a standard kit, you know, like your 4 different jackets and your 5 different mittens and your 3 different kinds of boots, because the conditions in the summer ranged from, you know, -30 to +5. So you need a different set of stuff. But and then anybody that's sort of worked in the cold at all, they've got their few favorite, you know, hats and mitts and whatever that they brought with them. And for conservation in particular, gloves was always a challenge, because, you know, we're like working on some tiny object, scraping with a little scalpel, but it's, you know, freezing cold, and you have to try to figure out a glove that you can move your hands well enough and not damage the artifact. And yeah, the gear was a challenge for sure.
Absolutely. There's a couple of questions here. The first one from Lori. She's wondering, did all the materials you took away for preservation get taken back to the hut, or did some of them get taken back to other museums?
Everything that we took away to get worked on came back to the hut. So Antarctica is very highly governed by international treaty, because nobody owns Antarctica. Nothing is allowed to leave the continent without a very specific permit, and that's like this arduous 2-year process through this multi-governmental body. A few objects did come off the ice for conservation that couldn't happen down there. For example, some of the whiskey, when they brought the whiskey back to sample it, and a few, there was like a watercolor painting and a handful of things that they didn't have the facilities to deal with down there got brought back. But when the trust decided to sort of start this project, they looked at a number of options. They were like, well, we can either leave everything where it is and let it just deteriorate. We can conserve some things and shore up the building and try to keep everything in situ for as long as possible. We could build a sort of a protective superstructure over the site, or should we just remove it all and bring it back to museums, because more people will see it and it will ostensibly be safer. But like I mentioned before, so many of the things are special because of their context in that environment, right? Like a tin of food in a museum just doesn't have the same cachet as it does when it's in the site where it was used, you know? And then also it's just a matter of ownership. Nobody owns those objects. So, you know, New Zealand government has supported this program so much, but it all originated from the UK, right? So it's sort of like who actually has ownership of it, and nobody really does. So that complicates, well, it complicates things, and it made the decision to leave things on the ice easier to a certain extent.
So I think that relates to the next question, which is from Jasper, who was wondering a little bit more about what you meant by the philosophical things that needed to be worked out about preservation. So part of that being the ownership that you're just discussing, the context, do we leave them here? Do we take them out? Where does that matter? But I imagine too, even as you're saying, things like, do you alter the original construction of the building to put up that protective barrier or to put a waterproofing on the roof? That's part of a philosophical discussion really for a conservator.
And I was reading a book the other day, and somebody called the conservator the narrator in many ways, because they do make a lot of the decisions that affect how people visiting the site experience it. Because yeah, any modern intervention is ostensibly changing that site. Even if it's helping to save it, you're still changing it. And the goal of conservation is always to keep things reversible so that you can undo what you do. But down there, that's not always an option, because you have a very limited roster of things like all the different glues that we would use in the museum. You know, the conservation department here probably has 20 different glues they can use to help repair objects. But down there, there's only one that lasts, you know, through the winter in the cold temperatures, only one that you can actually apply in the cold temperature. And that one just isn't as reversible as others. So every time you want to, you know, use an adhesive, it's like, okay, do we actually need to do this? Because we can't undo it. And like I was saying earlier with the blubber layer, there's also, you know, there was multiple stages of occupation in a lot of the buildings. So you had to think like, are we going to save everything to Scott's time? Are we going to save everything to Shackleton's later time? You know, we had to blend the two together. And there was also some very well-intentioned, but, you know, somewhat misguided efforts in the early 70s. So we were sort of undoing this layer of 70s restoration at the same time.
So many considerations that have to happen. And as you're saying, I think they're really fortunate that project had such an international team and different expertise from around the world to really contribute to the best possible result for that place and for those objects. Jana, thank you so much for jumping in today and helping fill in the space. We will be back with Nishka Museum next week, so we hope folks will join us for that. If you joined us late or you missed something or you just enjoyed the program and would like to share it, we have recorded this and you will find it on the Royal BC Museum's YouTube channel, so please have a look there. And our museum has reopened. Jana's been a big part of that, helping us get ready to get back in our exhibits, and right now her department's working on finish the rest of the second floor. So our old town and the ship, gold mine, all that area will be back up and running soon. So you can find out more on our website about timed tickets and which exhibitions are available and will be open. We are continuing our at-home kids and outside for the foreseeable future. So you can find out about our topics and links and programs again on the website. Again, next week we'll be chatting with the staff at the Nishka Museum in Northern BC, and we'll hopefully be able to take a virtual tour of that site. So please join us again next week. In the meantime, continue to take care of yourselves and one another. Thank you.